This is somebody who never stops thinking about India, who never stops thinking about what a post-colonial country is going to look like, whether it's in terms of its identity, whether it's in terms of its foreign policy. This is somebody who was very interested in ensuring that Indians tell their own story, both to themselves and the world. But he was present at almost all of modern India's milestones. He invited Sir Orelstein to come to Bikaner to excavate what became the first findings of the lost Indus Valley civilization, in which he has now shifted his stance on the princely states, and he is now saying that okay, they are great laboratories for self-governance, they are great laboratories for regional identity and preservation of regional identity.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to IndianExpress.com. We are here today to discuss the life and works of Mr. KM Panikkar, who is the subject of this new book, A Man for All Seasons, The Life of KM Panikkar. And I am joined by Narayani Basu, who has authored this book. Hello, Narayani, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adrija. Thank you for having me.
Narayani is a historian and a foreign policy analyst. She has authored two other books in the past. The first is on the relations between the United States and China, and the second, a book on VP Menon, who played a key role in the integration of the princely states. The subject of her third book, KM Panikkar, is yet another key player in India's independence. But like her book's title mentions, he was a man of all seasons. So he was a lot more than just the independence movement. He had a large number of interests, which often fed into his professional ventures as well. He moved from being a professor to a journalist, an editor, and then to occupy some of the tallest administrative positions in India. And he also had a very important role to play in establishing India's foreign policy. So we'll start this interview with, firstly, can you tell me what interested you about Mr. K.M. Panikkar to write a book about him?
So, the main capacity in which I knew of KM Panikkar was as his most controversial ambassadorship to Nationalist China as well as to the People's Republic of China. When I was researching my book on VP Menon, I came across Panikkar in the Chamber of Princes, where he was incredibly influential throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. And that interested me because the main question in my head was, how did somebody who was our ambassador in China, why was he in the Chamber of Princes? How did he get there? What brought him there? What kind of work was he doing there? Those were the initial questions that I had. I was obviously in the middle of researching VP Menon, so it was a rabbit hole for another time. When I actually began digging through the archives about KM Panikkar, I discovered that this was a man who from 1915 to 1963, right? And you mentioned quite a few of his job designations, so to speak. But he was present at almost all of modern India's milestones. He was a historian, he was a lawyer, he was a very ardent proponent of federation for India. He was the architect of our independent maritime policy. He was a member of the States Reorganization Commission. He served the princely states of Kashmir, Patiala, and Bikaner. He invited Sir Orelstein to come to Bikaner to excavate what became the first findings of the lost Indus Valley civilization. He was everywhere you look throughout modern India's story, which is why I also called it a man for all seasons, because he was, really speaking, to my mind, he was a man for many of modern India's seasons.
So before we move to his professional life, can you tell us a little bit about how was he as a person? While you were going through the archives, what did you feel that who was the person?
I think one of his friends, K. Ishwara Dutt, who was a journalist himself, described him really well when he said he was one of modern India's impossible men, which is to say that he was very difficult to, you can't give an elevator pitch for what you feel about KM Panikkar, because once you start going through his life, it's very difficult to pin him down. It's very difficult to explain. He starts off as this very scholarly, non-sporty boy in Kuttanad in modern Kerala. And from there, you see him evolving into this unsure but angry young man in a world which is at war. So he's in college in 1914, and he is in Oxford University between 1914 to 1918. And that is, I think, one of the first sort of phases where you notice KM Panikkar beginning to think about what it means to be an Indian, what it means to be India in general. Right, the world is at war. The national movement here is kicking up several notches, and he's writing about subjects that pretty much astounded me because when you're a first year student in college, you don't think about writing about complex things like citizenship and immigration and international relations. And KM Panikkar was writing about all of these things. And he was actively thinking about all of these things as well. And, I'm following him from Oxford to Aligarh to Paris to Berlin to, founding the Hindustan Times to all the princely states. And this is somebody who never stops thinking about India, who never stops thinking about what a post colonial country is going to look like, whether it's in terms of its identity, whether it's in terms of its foreign policy. This is somebody who was very interested in ensuring that Indians tell their own story, both to themselves and the world. And you see that reflected throughout his career. You also see certain flickerings of ambition, right? This is also somebody who enjoyed being at the center of power, who enjoyed being where policy was being made, where history was being made. There's a great sense of awareness also in KM Panikkar about the kind of time he was living through. There are a couple of places in his memoir, and his memoir forms one of the foundation stones for this biography. There are a couple of places in his memoir where he's talking about having visited Germany and Italy in the 1930s, right? And this is at the moment where war clouds are looming on the horizon, fascism is on the rise. He has an audience with Mussolini. And you can see, and this is a memoir, by the way, that is written and published in the 1950s. So by this point, he's lived through 2 world wars. He's seen the fallout, particularly of the Second World War. He's seen exactly what fascism is capable of doing. And yet, when he's putting his reflections down about people like Mussolini, you see this sort of awareness of the fact that he was in the presence of a man who was going to make history for better or for worse. And obviously, by the 1950s, we know it was for the worse, right? But this was somebody who was very aware of what he was living through and the kind of times he was living through, a world that was changing, a country that was changing. And honestly, as a biographer, it was very hard to keep up with him because I've never seen anyone who was capable of keeping abreast with that change in terms of how he thought about the country.
Yeah. Because he also sees India going through a large paradigm of shifts in his lifetime, and given the kind of positions he's in, he's pretty much also one of the makers of these changes as well. But I'm also, quite keen and curious to understand that he starts off as a college professor in Aligarh Muslim University, and he teaches at Calcutta University for a while. Then he moves on to become the editor of Hindustan Times. How is it that he then becomes the secretary of the Chamber of Princes? Why does that shift happen? It's quite a drastic shift.
Yeah.
So
I think that ties in a lot with the sense of ambition that I was talking about. So when he is teaching in Aligarh Muslim University, there's a sense first of contentment because he's always wanted to be an academic. He's always wanted to be surrounded by books and continue writing on the subjects that he enjoys writing about. But the national movement is reaching one of its peak periods at this point. I mean, throughout its course, the national movement goes through certain periods of ebbs and flows. At this point, 1919, 1920, the early 1920s, it's marked by a great deal of bloodshed. It's marked by a great deal of angst also for the national movement. You have Jallianwala Bagh happening, the passage of the Rollout Acts. The non-cooperation movement is at its height. You have Chauri Chaura happening. It's at this point that Panikkar decides that he wants to quit academia, join politics, because he wants to be able to contribute to the national movement. And again, you see a sort of intellectual evolution taking place because he's figuring out how he wants to do that. So you see a sort of hopscotching post Aligarh. He first goes as Gandhi's emissary to Amritsar to sort of mediate in the ongoing Akali problem in Amritsar. Comes back, founds the Hindustan Times, is there for barely a year and a half. Spends, after the Hindustan Times, after he leaves the Hindustan Times, he spends 2 of what I think are probably the most exciting years of his life in Paris and Berlin. And it's here that 2 things happen. One is he's already begun thinking about the princely states in a far more serious manner. A lot of that has to do with the end of the First World War, with the fact that the princes are now sitting up post the First World War. They're looking to be counted, they're looking to be compensated for their efforts to aid the empire in the war effort, which is why you have stuff like the Chamber of Princes being formed, etc. So the Raj is looking to throw them crumbs. The Raj is not obviously keen on giving too much too soon. And this goes not just for the princely states, but the whole of India in general. Panikkar is writing about the princely states from the early 1920s onwards. His first writings on it are written in 1920. He's written it right in the aftermath of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, where you have the Maharaja of Bikaner being one of the signatories to the Treaty of Versailles. And the Maharaja of Bikaner basically says that, we as Indians deserve to be counted because we represent 1/5 of the human race. Panikkar's early writings on the princes is marked a lot by scorn, and there's a certain sense of dismissiveness also, because he says, they're riddled with backstairs intrigue and they're more concerned with their zananas, etc. And in a sense, it sort of plays into the international perception of what the princess is, because the princes are very easy to lampoon. You have the Maharaja of Alwar, who thought nothing of setting his polo pony on fire because it wasn't performing up to standard. You have the Maharaja of Patiala, whose hedonism was legendary even then. So they were very easy to lampoon. It sort of detracts from the fact that many of the princes were actually also very erudite, articulate men who were thinking very seriously about their constitutional rights, about their sovereignty, about their privileges, and where they wanted to be as far as the Raj was concerned. From there, you have Panikkar sort of picking up on the fact that A, the princes want to be counted far more seriously than they have been before. B, there's a great space here that he can occupy as far as forming policy is concerned. And you see this or sort of instinctive knack that this man has for writing the right thing at the right time, being in the right place at the right time. So he's in Europe post leaving the Hindustan Times. He's carrying this manuscript with him, in which he has now shifted his stance on the princely states. And he is now saying that, okay, they are great laboratories for self-governance. They're great laboratories for regional identity and preservation of regional identity. We can think about bringing them on board a united model of India. So this is the first step towards federation. By no means is Panikkar the only voice speaking about federation at this point, right? There are plenty of other people who are speaking about federalism at this point, who are speaking about constitutional reform in those terms at this point. Where Panikkar succeeds is the fact that he knows people who are connected to the right people. So he gets this manuscript to be delivered to K.N. Haksar, who is in London at the time. Now, K.N. Haksar is advisor to Maharaja Hari Singh. He is in London at this point in order to seek legal counsel to represent the Chamber of Princes. Why? Because there's a Indian States Committee that's been formed that is coming out to India in 1928 to reassess the Raj's relationship with the princes. In itself, this is not a new development. The Raj has gone through this process of evolving its relationship with the princes over the course of its existence in India. The princes are now looking to represent themselves legally and sort of pull together a case for why they need to be listened to, for why their rights need to be protected, and for why the crown's paramountcy now needs to be loosened a little bit so that they can preserve their own rights. Huxley reads what Panikkar has written. Huxley is very interested. And you have this sort of lovely little scene in Panikkar's memoir. We do not know if it's true or not, but essentially he says that he gets the manuscript delivered, and then Huxley is staying at the Ritz in London. Panikkar writes that, I was walking outside the Ritz and Huxley happened to see me through the window and called me in. Now, we don't know whether this actually happened, but however that played out, Huxley meets Panikkar, says to him, look, I really like what you've written. Why don't you come on board this project and let's see what you can accomplish? And that is how Panikkar's journey with the princely estates begins. And it's a relationship that will continue throughout the 1930s till the early 1940s. From there, it's a short step to becoming Secretary of the Chamber of Princes, right? Because he becomes one of the leading voices, especially during the first round table. You can see Panikkar very clearly just hobnobbing with political leaders, with nationalist, Hindu nationalist politicians, with princes. His mandate is basically to ensure that all the princes pull together and unite on board the federal ship. This whole process actually was very interesting to write about as a biographer, particularly since my first book was on VP Menon, right? Because it is at this juncture, from the first roundtable onwards, and from the late 1920s onwards, that you see a process of integration beginning in more legal constitutional terms, right? So VP Menon, Sardar Patel bring the princes on board modern Union of India, and that's sort of the tail end of that process. Panikkar is at the beginning of that process. So both Panikkar and VP Menon bookend the process of integration, which I found very interesting.
Yes.
Because while Panikkar is representing the Chamber of Princes at the first roundtable, you have VP Menon on the sidelines taking notes as the young secretary there for the reforms department. And then you have, obviously, the process of federation rolling on through the 1930s. There's a lot of give and take. This part of the book for me was difficult because the archives on this are eye-crossing in terms of the amount of paperwork there is, amount of clauses that have to be rewritten, that have to be redrafted and re-looked at. There was so much at stake here, right? Because each of the princes had their own concept of what federation should be. Each of the princes also had their own personal rivalries with each other. They had their own doubts and apprehensions about each other. There was a lot of office politics, to put it very crudely, going on in the Chamber of Princes. Each of them also had their own individual relationships with the British residents in their states, with the incoming viceroys and outgoing viceroys. There were the political leaders also who had come to the round table with understanding of dominion status, which was different, right? So dominion status at that point tied in with what was happening across the rest of the world, which came in the heels of the Balfour Declaration in 1926. Dominion status essentially meant that you would be a self-governing entity within an overarching empire. So these guys had come representing dominion status. There was a lot of ambiguity around what federation could be. There was also the Muslim League that was incredibly annoyed about what its own safeguards would look like. We all know the first roundtable tanked. We all know the processes that led to the formation of the Government of India Act 1935, which, yes, it remains one of the greatest constitutional landmarks of our freedom movement. For Panikkar, however, it was beginning to represent something worse, because what was happening within the Chamber of Princes at this point was a lot of fractured attempts to pull together. There was a lot of dissent on the ground. There were attempts to sack him also from the secretaryship of the Chamber of Princes. There was Patiala pitted against Bikaner. There was Nawanagar, who was playing his own game on the side. There was the fact that C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer also had his own Machiavellian intentions throughout. All of this ensured that even though the Government of India Act represented the greatest chance for federation to take shape, it couldn't happen in the end, right? So by the end of the 1930s, there's no way that federation can happen. Panikkar knows this. He's very disillusioned. You have then the Second World War looming on the horizon. You have the Congress ministries resigning after what's been a great landmark for the freedom movement, with the first provincial elections happening. And you have, once the war is declared, Linditko, who was our viceroy at that point, sending India to war without so much as a bio leave. And then the idea of federation is lost for the moment, right? The moment has passed. But Panikkar in the princely states is somebody who really, really intrigued me, because I didn't know this facet of his career and of his life. And it was very interesting to see how he dealt with different personalities, with different egos, with different legal understandings of what federation should be and what a blueprint of modern India should look like.
Very interesting what you say. There is also a point in which you write about how he was not keen about the princely states joining Pakistan, by the early 1940s. That is when, but he's also, you write that he was very much a proponent of Pakistan. He calls himself a Pakistanist. Can you explain, like, why? What was his entire stance on this?
Well, I don't think he was a proponent of Pakistan. I think a lot of, the phrase Pakistanist comes from this letter that he has written in 1941 to one of his old friends from Aligarh days, Said Mahmood, in which he basically says that, Said, we need to forswear our dreams of a united India. And I'm now a Pakistanist. There is no other way forward but Pakistan. And for me, it spoke a lot about his personal disillusionment about this. I don't think Panikkar, like everyone else who was fighting for freedom at that point, wanted partition in any sense of the word, nor did he want Pakistan. But I think what he saw developing throughout the 1920s and 1930s, whether it was the dissension in the Chamber of Princes, whether it was the growing rage in the Muslim League, whether it was the rising sort of call for Pakistan that was beginning to develop and float about in the 1930s, when he's written this letter in 1941, the Lahore Resolution has happened and Jinnah has called for two nations, though he's not explicitly mentioned the word Pakistan. So Panikkar is seeing all of this. Panikkar is deeply, deeply shattered by this. And you see him actually not wavering from the fact that for him, Pakistan had become a very bitter reality. And he continues to make this claim throughout the 1940s, in fact. So in 1943, when he is in his early initial forays as a foreign policy Mandarin, and he is at Chatham House and he's giving a closed-door lecture. And he says it there as well, that, he doesn't believe that India with a strong center can exist without Pakistan. And he says it yet again in 1947 when Mountbatten has come out as India's last viceroy, and Alan Campbell Johnson, who was Mountbatten's press attaché, has heard of Panikkar, obviously, calls him for a meeting and says, okay, what are your thoughts about where we're at? And Panikkar tells him, and this was a rather memorable sentence, he said, Hindustan is an elephant and Pakistan is its two ears, and we can live without the two ears. Right? So there's this sense of immense bitterness there. I think that tinged the minds of everybody who was fighting for freedom at that point. I think everyone's first and biggest aim was always to pull for a united India, which is why you see Panikkar also, despite this bitterness over Pakistan and its existence, also constantly pushing the princely states, irrespective of where he was at that point. And in the early 40s, he was in Bikaner. constantly pushing for the princely states to acknowledge the fact that, look, in your states alone, you have so many popular movements. At this point where we're at, with the Second World War on, with India, pushing towards some kind of formation of independence, it's important for you guys to understand that the writing is on the wall. You will have to join a modern Indian Union, whatever that may look like. And the writing is on the wall for you guys. You need to understand that. And no amount of democracy can take place without the princely states and without the princely states joining a modern Indian Union. So you see these two twin sort of streams of thought in Panikkar at this point. Like it gets very defined from the late 1930s and through the 1940s, in fact.
Okay. And I'll shift to several years later to when he is part of the state's reorganization committee.
Yes.
And why I would like to connect it with, because he was also instrumental in bringing the princely states on board. And then he's the same person who's also part of the state's reorganization committee along linguistic lines. Does his stance on the princely states change by this time?
I think yes, it has changed by this point, because he's very much of the view that now, especially in a decolonizing world, princely states have no place. They must understand that there is a democracy that is being built, and they must be part of that. In 1955, this sort of plays into his own evolving role in forming and reforming what India is and what India should look like. So when he comes on board the States Reorganization Commission, he and Nehru are both of the same viewpoint, right? That post-transfer of power and partition, and the immensely tragic fallout that partition has had, nobody wants to reorganize the states according to linguistic borders. And this is irrespective of the fact that the Congress has, since the 1920s, been very committed to the idea of linguistic reorganizations. But Nehru has seen what partition has done. He's seen what the cost of transfer of power has been. And he's of no mind to acquiesce to a linguistic reorganization of the states. Panikkar shares this view. Now, it was interesting to me to see that when Panikkar actually starts traveling across the country and starts doing the surveys that are needed to be done, his mind changes and he says, okay, the core thing that we need to protect is India's federal core, its federal unity. The only way that we can do that is if we reorganize the states according to language, right? So he does this. The co-authoring of the States Reorganization Commission report it's a neat little thing. It's like 200 pages, essentially. He's also gone ahead and added a 10-page dissent note to the back calling for the bifurcation of Uttar Pradesh, right? Because he says it's too unwieldy at this point. And just in terms of population, in terms of size, we need to bifurcate it in order to maintain India's federal core at this point. Now, this report, Nehru is not happy with at all, because it's not what Nehru wanted, right? He had put Panikkar there also especially in order to ensure that the brief that he was given was carried out, which is that the Prime Minister didn't want the states to be reorganized on the basis of language. Yet here was this commission presenting a report that was in completely the opposite direction. And this is a bit of a digression, but here it sort of played into what I noticed throughout the careers of Nehru and Panikkar and their relationship with each other, which is that no matter where they differed, there was always a respect for the other's opinion. And you see that also as you go through Nehru's own private archives and his selected works that are published and in the public domain. You see this constant sense of unhappiness at what the States Reorganization Commission's report has been. But there is also this very reluctant acknowledgement that, okay, this is the report, this is what they've found, these are their findings, we will have to abide by them, right? And so a lot of it speaks to respect and discourse with each other, but it also speaks to Panikkar's readiness to adapt to changing circumstances and changing contexts as far as India was concerned. There was no static view that he held to. He was very ready to change what he felt once he had the evidence to prove that, okay, this is what India needs at this point, then this is what India needs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we conclude, my one last question to you is that, when we talk about the nationalist leaders, the makers of modern India, we've learnt about so many of these names like Sardar Patel or Nehru, of course, and these come to our minds. KM Panikkar is everywhere, come to think of it. But we haven't really, learnt about him with the same depth as we would probably learn about a Nehru and Patel. Why is that the case?
I think because it's honestly it's very easy to forget that sometimes, because when you're reading about an independence movement or a revolution or a very significant moment in a country's political history, it's more exciting and it's more soul stirring to read about, speeches and bloodshed on the streets and sloganeering, and each movement acquires its own face, right? Our independence movement has so many faces and names that they're almost symbolic at this point. What we tend to forget is behind the scenes of every revolution and behind the scenes of every great moment in history, there are people who are working to stitch it together, to legitimize it, to crystallize it in terms of its shape, its identity, its formation, whether that's in the form of paperwork like V.P. Menon did, whether that's in the form of constantly thinking about what a modern Indian republic should look like KM Panikkar did. There are always people behind the scenes, which is something that I hope my work brings out, because it fascinates me to know that this is something that we easily put aside. I think it's easy to put aside the fact that behind the scenes of everything, there are people who are working around the clock to think about what freedom should look like, what it should mean in terms of legislation, administration, constitution. What should that look like? We're pushing towards this great moment of freedom and decolonization, but actually speaking, what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Narayani. It was truly interesting talking to you, very enlightening knowing more about Mr. Panikkar, and all the best for your book.
Thank you so much, Adrija, for having me.